it was just another seasonal job, or at least that's what I told myself when I signed the contract. I didn't expect much. A little extra cash, some long hours, and endless streams of children posing for photos with Santa. Seemed easy enough. The mall was already packed when I arrived for my first shift, festive music echoing through the halls. There were garlands wrapped around every railing, red and gold ornaments catching the light. It was cheerful but almost too perfect, like someone had tried a little too hard to recreate the Christmas spirit. I checked in at the small staff office near the back, where a chipped sign on the door read seasonal team. Inside, a few of my coworkers were huddled around a table, chatting over lukewarm coffee. They barely looked up when I entered, except for one woman, a middle-aged lady with a clipboard who seemed to be in charge. She smiled at me, but it was a thin, practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You're the photographer, right?" she asked. Her tone was brisk, no time for pleasantries. I nodded, and she handed me a lanyard with a badge that read Mall Santa Team, Photographer. "Santa's already set up," she said, gesturing toward the main atrium. "Just keep things moving, no delays. And make sure you follow the checklist." Checklist? I wanted to ask, but she had already turned back to her clipboard. The setup was as elaborate as the rest of the decorations. Santa's throne, a massive red velvet chair, was framed by towering fake Christmas trees, their plastic needles dusted with artificial snow. A long line of children, clutching candy canes and chattering excitedly, snaked around the roped-off area. Parents hovered nearby, their phones in hand, ready to capture the moment. I slid behind the camera, adjusting the settings and framing the shot. Santa, a robust man with a beard that looked a little too real, gave me a wink as he hoisted the first child onto his lap. "Let's make some memories," he said, his voice booming. For the next few hours, it was all routine. Click, smile, next kid. Over and over. The line grew shorter as the evening went on, the crowd thinning as families trickled out of the mall. The festive music played on a loop, the same jingles repeated until they started to blur together. It was around the time when the mall lights dimmed slightly, a signal that closing time was near, that I noticed something odd. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on right away, just a feeling, like someone was standing too close, though when I glanced around, there was no one there. The air seemed colder near the Christmas setup, though the rest of the mall felt comfortably warm. I adjusted my scarf, trying to shake off the prickling unease crawling up my neck. Maybe it was the exhaustion, or maybe it was something else. As I packed up for the night, I glanced back at the display one last time. The Santa chair sat empty now, the trees casting long shadows across the floor. But for a moment, just a brief, fleeting moment, I thought I saw something move behind the trees. I blinked, shaking my head, probably just the shadows. But even as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching. The next day started like any other. I arrived early, hoping to shake off the lingering unease from the night before. The mall was quieter in the morning, the festive decorations still lit but without the usual swarm of shoppers. It almost felt peaceful, like the calm before a storm. As I made my way to the staff room, I noticed something odd. The door to the Christmas setup was slightly ajar. Normally, everything was locked up tight overnight, but here it was, cracked open just enough to see a sliver of the red carpet inside. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. It wasn't my job to check, but curiosity got the better of me. I pushed the door open slowly, peeking in. Everything seemed in place. The chair, the trees, the fake presents. But the air still carried that strange chill from the night before. "Don't touch anything." The voice startled me, sharp and stern. I turned to see Carl, the mall's janitor, standing behind me with a mop in hand. He was a wiry man in his 50s, with a perpetual frown etched on his face. "Sorry," I mumbled, stepping back. Carl's eyes narrowed. "They don't like it when things are moved around." Before I could ask who they were, he brushed past me, muttering something under his breath. Back in the staff room, the woman with the clipboard, her name tag said Evelyn, was already going through the morning briefing. A few other seasonal workers gathered around, most of them half listening as they sipped their coffee. "All right," Evelyn said, her tone brisk as ever. "A few reminders for today. Stick to your stations, follow the schedule, and remember the rules. Especially the rules." "Rules?" My ears perked up. "First," she continued, "don't leave the display unattended during your shift. Ever. If you need a break, call someone to cover for you." That seemed reasonable enough, though the emphasis on ever felt odd. "Second, no photos outside of official sessions. None. Not even as a joke." A murmur ran through the room. One of the guys, a teenager who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, raised his hand. "What's the big deal? It's just Santa and some props." Evelyn's gaze snapped to him, her eyes colder than I expected. "It's not your job to ask questions. Just follow the rules." The room fell silent. "Third," she said, her voice softening just a bit, "if you notice anything unusual, lights flickering, strange sounds, anything like that, report it immediately. Don't try to handle it yourself." This time, no one said a word. I couldn't shake how seriously Evelyn had delivered those instructions. It wasn't just the content of the rules, it was the weight in her tone. Like these weren't just guidelines, but something far more important. Throughout the day, I found myself watching my coworkers. Most seemed unfazed, going through the motions like it was just another paycheck. But a few seemed on edge. I noticed Sarah, one of the elves handing out candy canes, glancing over her shoulder every so often, her grip on the basket tightening. When I asked if everything was okay, she just forced a smile and said, "Just tired." Even Santa wasn't immune. During a lull in the line, I caught him rubbing his temples, his expression strained. "You all right?" I asked, keeping my voice low. He looked at me, his usual jolly demeanor slipping for just a moment. "Yeah," he said, his voice quieter than I expected. "Just long days, you know?" But it didn't feel like a full answer. As the evening wore on, I started to notice small inconsistencies. The checklist Evelyn had handed out at the start of my shift included things like wipe down the camera lens and check the alignment of the trees, but nothing about the rules she'd mentioned. And yet, everyone seemed to treat those unwritten rules as gospel. At one point, I saw Carl again, mopping the floor near the display. He worked methodically, his movements almost mechanical. I thought about asking him what he'd meant earlier, but something about his posture stopped me. When I finally wrapped up for the night, Evelyn was waiting by the staff room door. She handed me a printed list, her expression unreadable. "These are the night protocols," she said. "Make sure you follow them before you leave." I scanned the list, my stomach tightening. It included instructions like, ensure all lights are turned off, but do not unplug the trees. Double check that the Santa chair is centered on the carpet. Lock the display doors and confirm they're secure twice. Twice? I glanced up at Evelyn. Why all the extra precautions? It's just a mall display. Her eyes met mine, and for a split second, I thought I saw a flicker of something. Fear? Frustration? "Just do it," she said firmly. "And don't linger after hours." As I left, the unease from the night before returned, heavier this time. The rules weren't just rules, they were warnings. That night, as I locked the doors to the Christmas display, Evelyn's words echoed in my mind. Don't linger after hours. The mall was quiet now, the festive music silenced. leaving only the hum of the air vents and the distant click of Carl's mop. I double-checked the locks on the display room, just as the instructions said. My hands fumbled slightly, not from cold but from an uneasy feeling I couldn't quite shake. I pulled the door handle once, twice locked. Satisfied, I turned to leave, but something stopped me. It was faint, almost imperceptible. A soft shuffling sound from inside the display. I froze, my hand halfway to my coat pocket. It wasn't loud enough to be footsteps, but it wasn't nothing either. My first thought was that maybe someone had stayed behind, a kid hiding for a prank, maybe. I hesitated, my pulse quickening. The practical thing to do would have been to walk away, let security handle it. But against my better judgment, I leaned closer to the door, pressing my ear against the cold metal. Nothing. I told myself it was my imagination, the kind of trick exhaustion plays after a long shift. Still, my feet moved faster than usual as I walked out of the mall. The next day started with the same routine. Check in, grab my badge, and head to the display. But something was different. The chair, the massive red throne where Santa sat every day, was slightly off-center. Not by much, just a few inches, but enough to catch my eye. I frowned, remembering the protocol to double-check its placement the night before. I was sure I had left it in the right spot. Morning, I turned to see Sarah, the elf, already setting up the candy canes. Her usual forced smile looked even more strained today. Morning, I replied, gesturing toward the chair. Did someone move this? Sarah barely glanced at it. Carl probably did while cleaning. He's always messing with stuff. She said it casually, but her tone didn't match her words. There was something behind it, a tension, like she was trying too hard to sound normal. As the day went on, small, almost insignificant details began piling up. The Christmas lights around the display flickered now and then, just enough to be noticeable. One of the fake presents under the tree had shifted slightly, its ribbon fraying as if it had been dragged. And then there were the photos. It was during a quiet moment, while the line for Santa thinned out, that I decided to scroll through the pictures I'd taken the day before. Most were normal, kids smiling awkwardly, parents beaming with pride. But as I swiped, one image stopped me cold. It was a shot of a little girl, no older than 5, sitting on Santa's lap. She was smiling, her hands clutching a stuffed reindeer. But in the background, just behind the edge of the Christmas tree, there was something. It wasn't clear, more of a shadow than a figure. But it was there, unmistakably human-shaped. My first instinct was to dismiss it as a trick of the light, but the more I stared, the less sure I became. That evening, I stayed later than usual. Part of me wanted answers, though I wasn't sure what I was even looking for. The mall was nearly empty as I finished packing up, the displays dark except for the faint glow of the Christmas tree lights. I was just about to leave when I heard it again, the faint shuffling noise. This time it was closer. My throat tightened as I turned toward the display. The locked door stood exactly as I had left it, but the sound was unmistakable now, like someone moving behind the trees. My heart raced as I debated my next move. Walk away, I told myself, but something, curiosity, stupidity, maybe both, made me stay. I reached for my phone, switching on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness as I slowly opened the door. Inside, everything looked normal at first glance. The chair was back in its proper place, the trees as pristine as ever. But the air felt heavy, colder than it should have been. I stepped closer to the chair, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. That's when I saw it, the fake present with the frayed ribbon. It was halfway across the room, nowhere near where it should have been. And then the lights flickered, just once, but long enough to make my stomach drop. When they came back on, the chair wasn't empty anymore. I froze, my flashlight trembling as I aimed it at the chair. There was nothing there, no one. But for a split second, I could have sworn I saw something. A figure, sitting perfectly still, watching me. I didn't wait to find out. I stumbled out of the room, locking the door behind me with shaking hands. As I hurried toward the exit, I glanced over my shoulder one last time. The door was locked. I was sure of it. But the chair? It was off-center again. I didn't sleep well after that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that chair, just slightly off-center, and the faint impression of someone, or something, sitting there. By morning, I'd convinced myself I had imagined it all. Exhaustion, bad lighting, nerves, it could have been anything. But as I walked into the mall that day, I noticed something unsettling. The staff seemed different, quieter, more withdrawn. Sarah, usually at least trying to keep up her cheerful elf act, wouldn't meet my eyes. Even Carl, who always had some gruff comment, seemed to avoid everyone, focusing intently on his mop as though the floor held all the answers. I tried to brush it off and get through the day, but the tension in the air was impossible to ignore. Small things started to stand out, things I hadn't noticed before. Evelyn watching the display from the edge of the atrium, her face pale and drawn. The way Santa's laughter seemed to falter mid-sentence, his gaze drifting toward the shadows behind the trees. As the day wound down, Evelyn gathered the team for a quick meeting. Her usual brisk tone was gone, replaced by something softer, almost uneasy. "I know this time of year can be stressful," she began, her hands gripping her clipboard tightly. "But let's all remember to stay focused and careful." Careful? It was such a strange choice of words. She continued, "If anyone feels uncomfortable or notices something unusual, come to me immediately. Don't try to handle it yourself." Her eyes swept over the group, lingering on me for just a moment longer than the others. It wasn't hard to guess what she meant by unusual. That evening, as the mall emptied out, I found myself alone at the display again. It wasn't intentional, just bad timing. Sarah had left early, claiming she wasn't feeling well, and Santa had disappeared without a word after the last photo. I was halfway through packing up when the lights flickered again. This time, it wasn't just a brief dimming. They went out completely, plunging the display into near darkness. The only light came from the faint glow of the Christmas tree, casting long, uneven shadows across the room. My stomach tightened as I fumbled for my phone, the beam of its flashlight shaky in my hand. I aimed it toward the chair first, empty, thank God. But then I heard it, a low, scraping sound, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. My breath caught in my throat as I swung the light toward the noise. Nothing. The sound stopped, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. I wanted to leave, to run, but something made me stay. I told myself it was just the building settling, maybe Carl moving something in the distance. But deep down, I knew better. I turned back to the display, determined to finish locking up and get out of there as quickly as possible. But when I stepped closer to the chair, my flashlight caught something I hadn't seen before. Footprints. They were faint, barely visible in the soft layer of fake snow scattered across the floor. But they were there, leading from the chair to the edge of the trees where they simply stopped. My heart pounded as I followed them, the beam of my flashlight trembling. "Hello!" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. I took a shaky step closer to the trees, my breath visible in the cold air. That's when I saw it. A figure just barely visible behind the branches. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. My flashlight flickered, the beam cutting out for a split second before returning. And when it did, the figure was gone. Panic set in, but I forced myself to stay calm. I stepped back toward the door, keeping the flashlight trained on the display. "This isn't funny," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. The chair creaked, I whipped the flashlight around, the beam landing squarely on the chair. And this time it wasn't empty. Someone or something was sitting there. It wasn't Santa. The figure was too thin, its posture too rigid. Its head tilted slightly as though studying me. I couldn't see its face, just the outline of its body, dark and unmoving. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out. The figure didn't respond. For what felt like an eternity, we stood there, locked in some unspoken standoff. Then slowly it raised a hand, not to wave but to point. At me. That was enough. I turned and ran, not bothering to lock the door behind me. My footsteps echoed through the empty mall as I sprinted toward the exit, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. When I finally burst outside into the cold night air, I doubled over, hands on my knees, trying to catch my breath. For a moment I felt safe, but then I glanced back toward the mall. Through the glass doors, I could see the Christmas display in the distance. The chair was empty again, perfectly centered on the carpet. But I knew what I'd seen, and no matter how much I tried to convince myself otherwise, one thought refused to leave my mind. It wasn't over. I didn't go back the next day. Couldn't. I called Evelyn early in the morning, my voice shaky as I tried to explain. "I'm not feeling well," I said. It wasn't a lie. I hadn't slept at all, and my chest still felt tight with the weight of what had happened. She didn't press me for details, just sighed and said, "All right, get some rest." Rest. That felt impossible. I spent most of the day staring at the photo I'd taken, the one with the shadowy figure behind the tree. I zoomed in over and over, hoping to find some logical explanation. A reflection, a trick of the light, anything. But the more I looked, the less sense it made. Who or what had been standing there? The days turned into weeks, but the unease never left. Every time my phone buzzed with a notification from the mall's group chat, my stomach flipped. I stopped checking after a while. Whatever updates they had, I didn't want to know. Still, I couldn't avoid the memories. They lingered in the quiet moments, in the hum of my apartment's heater, in the faint creaks of the floorboards at night. Sometimes, I swore I heard the same soft shuffling sound I'd heard that night at the mall. At first, I told myself it was just my imagination, my nerves playing tricks on me. But then, one night, I woke up to find my bedroom door slightly open. I never leave it open. The fear became a constant undercurrent, shaping the way I moved through my days. I avoided malls altogether, flinching every time I heard Christmas music in passing. Friends asked me what was wrong, why I'd been so distant, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them. How do you explain something like this without sounding crazy? I thought about quitting photography altogether. Every time I picked up my camera, I felt that same chill from the display room. But it wasn't just the camera, it was the act of looking, of framing the world through a lens. What if I saw something I wasn't supposed to see? Even now, months later, the feeling hasn't entirely gone away. It's quieter, more subtle, but it's there waiting. Every time I hear a faint creak or catch a shadow moving in the corner of my eye, I freeze. I don't know what I saw in that mall. I don't think I ever will. But one thing's for sure. Whatever it was, it saw me too. Subscribe for more horror stories every day.